Welcome to our lecture today, and in fact, this is one of my really interesting topics. I think this is actually kind of like one of the coolest things that we see in the history of India is just how Islam established itself in South Asia and creates one of the more vibrant and interesting sort of living forms of Islam that you can see in the world. So let's get right to it and look at three different strategies that we had in our readings for today about how Islam is established in South Asia. The first is clearing of land, establishing agriculture, and establishing religious institutions. The second is scriptural geography, and we're going to look at Adam's Peak and how one can rethink a geographic place with a new scriptural story that one wouldn't naturally anticipate it to be there. And finally, spiritual practices that can be incorporated and altered to fit one's own religious structure. So the first one, so clearing land, agricultural, introducing agriculture and institutions. And in our picture here, we have just looks exactly like what things look like in the Deccan, sort of central India, where you'll be sort of out and you'll see just lots of rice cultivation and palm trees and these beautiful rocky formations in the background. And you'll just have these lovely little mosques that pop up in the middle of nowhere. And if you're going there and you happen to speak the languages, you can go and talk to the people that attend these mosques that are usually little dargahs. And you remember what a dargah was, but a dargah is a shrine to a Sufi saint. And usually they can tell you all sorts of wild and cool stuff. I was one time out in Maharashtra, and this guy, I'm sure I'll talk about this again, this attendant of this dargah lets us like hang out in there, and we got to actually fold all the sort of special cloths that drape the dargah. We get to offer flowers there. And then he starts talking in this like hybrid Marathi Hindi. And my buddies spoke Marathi really well. I don't speak Marathi. But when he'd shift to the Hindi, I could understand really well. And he starts looking at the 4 minarets. I mean, like each one of those corresponds to the Vedas. And he starts talking about different surahs in the Quran and connecting it to different like energy channels in the body. And I'm just like, what is it? I've never heard any of this before. But it shows one of the ways, and that would be sort of our third way in which one sort of incorporates different spiritual ideas onto places and into places and into things. But you can find that sort of stuff in sort of rural India, and these are. And why do you find them only in rural India? Because that's where the older stuff is. That's where the urbanized folk haven't sort of cleaned it all up and made it all consistent. I like things that are inconsistent. Anyway, so we read Eaton's text, and we have 2 scholars today, Richard Eaton and Carl Ernst, who, for my money, are some of the best scholars out there, and delightful gentlemen. If you can meet either of them, they're really both quite a hoot. Okay, so Eaton establishes that in Bengal, remember we're back in Bengal here, a charismatic saint would just sort of enter a place and make connections with these local rulers. Then those rulers would sort of grant them, that saint, some sort of authority or a large tract of land, usually that was heavily forested. And then the saint would gather folk together, clear the forest, build a mosque, and then establish wet rice cultivation. Along with that, they would, from radiating out from that mosque, they would establish religious institutions that would be like charity and organization of work, and the mosque becomes sort of a social center. So whereas you previously had just sort of people living in a forest, worshiping usually like Hindu forest deities that might not even be all that Hindu, now you have people with jobs, you have a social institution of the mosque, you have a gathering place for people, and as they convert, they really move from sort of a tribal existence to being a part of the Indic world and the greater Muslim world. So elsewhere, Eaton describes how these charismatic figures, these Sufi saints, would show up and perform miracles. They would stare down tigers. They would heal snake bites. They would heal human beings who just had illnesses and help children. But at the same time, they would also bring cultivation of wet rice and agriculture. So over time, these generations, people wouldn't just convert to becoming Muslims. They'd be like, but they were into holy people. Indians tend to be like into like holy charismatic figures. Doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or a Hindu, they're kind of India. So what happens is over several generations, and usually the saint would die and they would establish a dargah for him, and usually there'd continue to be people going there and praying and miracles and whatnot, and the power of the saint would still radiate from that place. Over time, people would be like, well, we might as well become a Muslim because that guy's been taking care of us for generations. So we're not getting into that aspect today. We're going to get into that more in our next class. But so that's the first one, is clearing land, agricultural, and establishing religious institutions. The second is spiritual geography. Now, Karl Ernst here describes a Persian text that describes Ceylon or Sri Lanka. So that's the island nation to the east and south of India, just off the coast of Tamil Nadu. So this place is said to be the site of Adam's descent. So after Adam, from Adam and Eve, from the Garden of Eden, after he sort of leaves, after he's dispelled from the Garden of Eden, then he and Eve have to go down, and where do they end up? The argument here is they end up in Sri Lanka, at a place called Adam's Peak, and we're going to look at, and this is a picture of it right here, of the actual place where people go all the time, and it's a shared shrines, it's funny to say, of Shaivas, Buddhists, and Muslims all go there. Okay, so what happens is, if this is the case, then India is a holy place because it's the first place humanity came to, and Muslims have always resided there in this land of India and Sri Lanka. But also, that means that the first man is Indian. We're all Indian. That part always makes me happy. Okay, so we are not out of Africa, we're all out of India in the first place. Okay, so the text uses myth and literature that is found throughout the Arabic and the Indian world. And then they combine this with the knowledge of the actual location and pilgrimage site in Sri Lanka. Which, in order they can argue that India has always been Muslim and has always been a site holy for Muslims. What about spiritual practices? Well, there are well-established yoga practices for breath control and meditation. That includes like manipulating the chakras and alchemy and divination of one's health and one's sort of life forces and whatnot. And these are reframed in a specific text we're going to look at in Islamicate language. So they shift from sort of a Sanskritic, Hindi perspective into Persian. And as that happened, these texts traveled quite a way. We'll also see that the Yoga Sutras, or I'll just mention it several times, were translated into Persian and then they went all over the place as well. In fact, Dara Shikoh, who was one of the early Mughal rulers, who's son of Aurangzeb, he and sort of Akbar was interested in this too. So there were a bunch of like Mughals who were really into Indian yoga, meditation, and philosophy. They sometimes translated these texts themselves. Sometimes they had people translate them, and then those texts traveled throughout the Islamic world. So what I'm going to argue here is that in fact, Islam is a world-building, world-transforming force. This is an argument by Peter Berger. What is religion? A world-building, world-transforming force. I would say establishing, transforming, maintaining. It's a force, it's like a cluster of qualities in culture that enable us to maintain ourselves. Okay, so the first one, and this is the one we're going to talk about the most, clearing land, agriculture, institutions. Now we're looking at Bengal again. So I got my faces in the way here, but if you can see, so that's where Bengal is. There's Bangladesh and Bengal. Remember, this is also where Magadha was, where the Buddha and Mahavir were from. And over here you can see this section of rivers and this river delta. A delta is where rivers sort of span out and then create sort of marshy wetlands all around. Perfect for wet rice cultivation. So this area experienced a geographic shift right around the 15th and 16th century when the Ganges River sort of moved, and as it moved, it created this huge, very fertile delta, and created all these tiny little river tributaries, and this is the area that is now Bangladesh today. In the south, it's called the Sundarbans. Okay. So there were Hindus sort of in the west of Bengal, but in the East Bengal, there weren't a lot of people there. The people that were there were living in the forest. There wasn't a lot of culture going on. So we have a couple of eras of Muslim rule that we should be aware of. The Delhi Sultanate, which was the first sort of imperial Muslim sort of project in India, made it over to Bengal in the year 1204. However, things didn't go terribly well. I mean, they established rule well, But it wasn't really until the 1500s when the Mughals came. Remember, the Mughals are the Mongols, the Central Asian folk that swept down from Central Asia and sort of took over the Islamic rule of India. This Mughal period actually coincides with that shift in the river that I talked about, where this Bengali delta sort of got created, where there were tons and tons of wetland. So what caused the rise of Muslims and Islam in East Bengal? Well, you have three reasons. One, you had the Muslim empires that pushed east, the Mughals came in. Two, economic, you had more land and you had more farming going on. And three, the rise of Islam was of course caused by, there was a shift from sort of local forest deities to Islam. All right, so we're going to look at a couple of texts today. The first is the Mongol Cavea of Sheikh Jalaluddin Tabrizi. So Mongol Cavea just means sort of like, it's a Sanskrit phrase, it means sort of fine writings for praise. Mongol means praise, Cavea means like fine writings or fine poetry. So this is a 16th century text about a saint from the 1300s, or from the 13th century. You see this a lot. When the people are writing about saints, they depict them in a way that is important for the present, even though that's different from how they were depicted in the past or how they were originally, I don't know, when they were alive. So in this story, we're seeing a sort of foundation myth for agriculture and land clearing in Bengal in the 16th century. So a story about a 13th century guy to justify stuff going on in the 16th century. So the story is pretty basic. What happens is you've got this Sufi saint who's sent off by his teacher, and of course the teacher gives him a magic amulet, a pot that is always filled with water, a staff that'll cow anyone, and shoes that allow him to travel long distances. These are the standard things that most holy people have all about India. So what happens is eventually he meets a king, and the king, who had previously been killing Muslims left and right, takes a shine to him. So he's impressed by the guy's sanctity, by his magic powers and whatnot. And he said, you know, why don't you go ahead and build a mosque? So this sheikh, Tabrizi, said, well, all right, let's build this mosque. I'm going to build this mosque. I got authority to build this mosque. But nobody knows how to build a mosque. So he has to get everybody together and teach him how to build a mosque. Note, he's not only going to establish sort of agriculture and clearing land, but he's also going to introduce ideas of Islamic construction, so more sophisticated constructions than were there before. So he builds this mosque, the king digs it, and he gives him a whole bunch of forest. And so what happens is the sheikh clears the forest with all his pals, and the king also gives him a whole bunch of money that he's supposed to distribute as charity. Well, everything's going really well, so the sheikh Tabrizi starts wandering around. There's all these cities around, and he goes there, and he gets them all on board, and they all kind of integrate into one society. He sets up marketplaces and whatnot. And then as the mosque is really taking out, he uses the mosque to distribute funds, cultures, charities, and establish marketplaces around. So he introduces a culture where there was previously just forest and clans. Does that sound familiar? Doesn't he sound a little bit like the prophet, peace be upon him, that he takes people who are in sort of a chaotic state and moves them into a place where they are much happier and they are in a more cultured place and a more organized place. So there's, as a contrast, there's this Mongol Cavea, this set of worshipful words to the goddess Chandi, who's a Hindu. So there's a story about this hunter, and this hunter is harassing all the animals in the jungle. So the animals go to this goddess Chandi, who's a tribal goddess of the forest, and she hears this complaint, and she says, all right, I got this. She goes to the hunter and says, okay, I'll give you a kingdom if you'll stop harassing the animals and you build me a temple. He does so. So she protects him, and she gives him a ring, and he sells the ring in order to get the money to clear all the land in the area. But even if you look in the Mongol Cavea, the people he hires are Muslims. Who are the people that are always clearing the land? We see in all of these things, they are the Muslims who are clearing the land. And this is why Islam established itself so well in this area, is because they first cleared the land via the institutions that were established in Islam. Like I said, world establishing, world transforming, world maintaining force, Islam. So we have another hagiography of this Shah Jalal. Let me move my head again. So you have this word hagiography. Hagios, the thing that is most set apart, and graphy, to write about. we know the term pornography, porno female graphy, to write about. So writing about or depicting of women. So you can remember that way. So hagiography is writing about saints and holy people. So again, as I'd said before, these are tales that are told according to the present. So we have three sort of stages in the depiction of this Saint Shah Jalal over the years. So in the first depictions we find in various travel writings and sort of early writings about saints in India, he's just described as like an old guy with incredible ascetic powers and has some magical powers. Then we have a collection of Sufi Saints. It was written during a sort of early Mughal period, in which he's depicted as a warrior saint. Now, in these sort of depictions in this time, in this genre of warrior saints, the Sufis are depicted coming from the north, in the Mongol area, coming down into India, conquering local rulers, winning lots of battles, and converting everyone in sight. Then, further on, and this is the one we see the most about Shah Jalal in India today, is of him as a pious agriculturalist. So depending on the time period, maybe when he was first alive, he was just depicted as an old guy who was a very powerful ascetic, or maybe at that time period when they were writing, that was the ideals of the saints at the time. Then you have ideals of saints as warriors, so you depict them as a warrior. Then you have the ideals of these saints as sort of pastoralists. Remember, it's also 16th century, right around the time that Muslims are clearing land and introducing wet rice cultivation, so you want them to be an agriculturist. So what's Shah Jalal's tale? And this is a great little picture. This is where Shah Jalal's sort of mosque and shrine is still today. So the worship of him continues. So originally they say he was born in Yemen, not Central Asia, as it was depicted when he was depicted as a warrior saint. Again, the births of these guys change more to the Arabic world as they start trying to, as you find that people in general in India try to start establishing authority by being connected to the Arabic world instead of, Afghanistan. So he has this teacher, and he sort of studies with him, and he studies with his teacher, and he becomes very, very accomplished. But his teacher says, you got to go to India because you know Indian languages. I don't know how he does, but he just does. But he also gives him this lump of like perfect dirt. And he carries around this clump of dirt, and he wanders off to India. And at one point, he comes to a great river, and he sets down his prayer mat, and he's able to use his prayer mat to go across the river. And this sort of inspires people to think he is one kind of powerful guy. So a king he meets, and he really digs, and he grants him dominion over a bunch of space. What does he do? Well, Shah Jalal instantly is like, I'll build a mosque. So he builds this mosque, and as he's doing so, he starts like looking at all the dirt around, and he looks at the dirt, the sacred dirt that his teacher gave him, and said, it's the same. This is the place. Let's set up agriculture. So again, we see this connection of clearing land, Islam, agriculture. Now, one could just think these are interesting dynamics and little stories, but there's more to it. When we look at sort of Mughal documents, now the Mughals were interesting because they had like a whole system of like clerks, lawyers, and they had networks of communication between all the different like Mughal kingdoms. It was like suddenly bureaucracy had come to India, and India has never recovered. Anyway, so they were great clerks and great record keepers. What we see is that we have a couple of instances from our reading. We see one that when the military was wandering around, they had with them plowmen, so dudes who could plow and could make plows, and woodcutters to clear the land. And then when the land was cleared, they would have people show up and they would give them plows. So again, Islam, but here military Islam associated with military, associating with agriculture. Now, we also see in a number of sort of inscriptions that what would happen is a mosque would be granted money as long as they would clear land. Or you'd see that once a mosque was established in a place after it had been cleared by a local Muslim community, then the revenues from those lands would be connected to the mosque and support the mosque. Again, Islam and cultivation. Okay, so Islam is a world-building, world-transforming force. Just as the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, brought together warring pre-Muslim tribes in the Arabic world, set up a society, set up the pillars of Islam, social institutions, mosques, all this stuff, and created a sort of utopia. In the same way, Tabrizi our first sheikh, he sort of finds a place, connects with local rulers, gets them all on the same page, builds religious institutions, sets up agriculture, then uses those institutions and agriculture to support the community, the Muslim community, and setting out a whole new economy in the region. In the same way, Shah Jalal comes to a place, gets everybody on the same side, builds a mosque, sees that it's perfectly fertile, and says, this is where we got to be because it's a fertile place. All right, so the other arguments we have is sacred geography and mythology, and we'll also talk about spiritual practices. So here we have some pictures of this place in Sri Lanka, Adam's Peak, and it has a footprint, and the footprint is thought to be either Adam or the Buddha or Shiva, and everybody's pretty happy with that. I mean, the conflict is difficult to understand in Sri Lanka, so I'll just stay out of it right for now. But anyway, so we have this guy named Azad, whose name means free. He lived from 1704 to 1786. Now, he pulls from a wide range of Arabic and Persian texts to argue that Adam descended from heaven to earth at a place called Adam's Peak in Ceylon. Now, he would have known about the shrine. The shrine to the footprints would have been there. So he had that in his head. But then he sort of digs around in these Persian and Arabic texts and sees this stuff about Adam being first descending in India and the Garden of Eden being in India. Other people argue it's in Saudi Arabia. But he found all this sort of stuff in the Arabic and Persian, like classical archives. And one thing that Karl Ernst makes a big point of is he's not making stuff up. He's drawing from an established tradition within literature. All right, so he writes a text called The Choral Rosary of Indian Antiquities. And in this, he sets out some amazing arguments about India, and he's talking about India and Ceylon together, Sri Lanka being together. Now, there is a foundational text for Sri Lanka called the Mahabhamsha, or the Great Lineage, that sort of gives all of these really intriguing sort of stories about how Sri Lanka was formed, and has a lot of parallels with the Odyssey, to the point that we're beginning to track out that we think the Odyssey influenced the Mahabhamsha. Could be the other way around, but likely Odyssey to Mahabhamsha to Odyssey. Anyway, so what are these great ideas? They're pretty cool. So here's our first big argument: Adam's descent, and what is Adam's descent? So Adam and Eve are living in this glorious Garden of Eden. They eat from the tree of life, tempted by the snake, whatever, and they get kicked out. So where do they go? We don't really know, other than they're supposed to wander the earth. And they can't go back to the garden because it's guarded by an angel with a sword. Well, in this case, we say he went to Sri Lanka. So let's talk a little bit about some of these arguments in this choral rosary of Indian antiquities. So one of the first things that's argued is that this makes Adam's Peak a holy place second only to Mecca. Mecca is the holiest place, but if this is a place where Adam came down, then this is inherently a holy place. Now remember, a lot of people are going to be thinking, Islam, it came to India in like 1200s. No, it's not a sacred place. But he's digging around. He finds some arguments in the Persian archives. He says, let me set it out. He said, well, if this is the case, then this is a holy place, second only to Mecca. It's the place where the first pilgrimage started. So the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim has to do in their life. The argument is that, and this is so slick, and you find it toward the end of the piece we read today, is that what happened was Adam went to Adam's Peak in Sri Lanka, but Eve ended up in Jeddah near Mecca. So Adam took the first pilgrimage to the Hajj to get to see his lady Eve. But if that's the place where it started, the first pilgrimage, then that's a big deal too. What are some other holy ideas? We're working with a more sort of Sufi idea that there was this essential light within all of the prophets that is not necessarily the same, but there's this essential quality about them. This argues that that light of Muhammad would have been present in Adam. And in fact, Adam would have been the first representative of that light, that divine light in the world. Muhammad's the last one. There won't be another one. But Adam was the first one, moving through all the prophets. So this kind of argues that Adam is a prophet and puts him in that tradition, but that makes the place holy. The staff of Moses that he uses throughout the book of Exodus, whether it's to mess with Pharaoh or to part the Red Sea or to turn into a snake or to heal people, it's argued that Adam planted a tree, and at at the peak, and it grew up to become the staff that became the staff of Moses. Okay, we also see, where's my, okay, that got out of focus. Don't worry about it. We see that all fruits, all perfumes, all tools used to build stuff derive from Adam's descent and are linked to the Garden of Eden. So all of that stuff comes from Sri Lanka as well. The black stone, which is found in the Kaaba and Mecca, which is probably a meteorite of some part, and it comes to sort of early, it's a holy site in Islam that is linked to pre-Islamic culture, but it remains sort of worshipped and integrated into the Hajj and into Islam. It argues that, well, the text argues that Adam carried the black stone from the heavens in his descent, and then he distributed it, and then other holy figures kind of got it to Mecca later, the different prophets. Finally, they argue that Adam was Indian, because he was that's the first place he ended up. So if he came down to India, he's Indian. We're all Indian. Not out of Africa, but out of India. So look at this guy, this Muslim guy smiling with henna in his hair, and think, we're all Indian after all. I enjoy that argument. So in this way, Arabic also becomes a sacred language. Now, that's true because it's been used for a long time in India, but it also shows that there are lots of references to India being a sacred place outside of India, namely in these texts, in these Arabic and Persian texts. So the already existing holy place of Adam's Peak is given a Muslim backstory, and all of the elements are recast with India as a holy land, if not the original holy land, as the site of all humanity reaching the earth. So the final idea is spiritual practices that are sort of colonized, appropriated, repackaged in one way to another. And what we saw was that there was a yoga text, which is translated into Persian, and it manipulates a lot of esoteric sort of yogic ideas. Now, Ernst argues it actually wasn't all that effective because people look at it and go, I don't know if this really works. But what I want you to look at is I want you to see how Indic ideas are connected to sort of Islamicate ideas. And there's a conversation that goes back and forth. Now, Islam integrated lots of interesting stuff. They have the Neoplatonists. We would have lost the works of Aristotle if they hadn't been worked into Arabic. I was looking at a text, I think a grimoire right now. It's called the Picatrix. And that we have in Islamic, and we have it in Arabic and Persian. Then it goes to Latin, but it was originally in Greek. And sort of our linchpin on this text, which is a book of spells that are also about astrology, the only way we would have ever had that link to the Greeks is because the Arabic world translated it, wrote commentaries on it, expanded upon it. So the Arabs regularly, and Islamic culture regularly, takes out cultural stuff that they find interesting or useful, turn it into Arabic and give it Islamic sort of language and sort of move right on with it and continue. So there's this text that's called the Amrit Kunda, which means something like the nectar pit or the well of nectar. It was translated into Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Urdu from the 17th century onward. It was written by a guy named Shams al-Din Muhammad Amuli. Now, it does describe yogis. So remember that yogi is somebody who does yoga, and in particular, they're kind of scary guys in India. And in North India, they're just called jogis. So we do notice that in the translation, the term jogi, not yogi, is used. There's no word for yoga, but there is the Arabic word riyazat, which means something like asceticism or holy practice. Now, this is a text that has a number of sections, and in the first one, we have all of this sort of yogic material, but it's in a section on natural science. Now, you think natural science, you think like earth science. But natural sciences is like alchemy, dream interpretation, medicine, but kooky alchemical medicine, occult sciences, agriculture. I grabbed this picture here. This is Paracelsus, who was a guy who in the Western world codified the idea of the elements. And he talked about the natural sciences as being sort of the equivalents that one can manipulate if you know them. So he was the one that argued, and this is a very classic argument in natural science, that salamanders cause fire. What are you talking about there? And if you ever work in a kitchen, that big like broiler you have up high is called salamander. This is why. Because when they would burn wood, as the wood would ignite, salamanders who were living in the wood would come out, and they're like, salamanders are associated with fire. So then they'd go work with salamanders and fire and sort of figure out all these sort of pre-scientific science. That's what the natural sciences are. It's almost like the magical sciences of manipulating correspondences and sympathetic magic. So in this text, we have a lot of writing about breath and chakras. So breath would be like prana here. And chakra, remember that's a wheel. In this text, there are 9 energy centers. And what you really see here is a sort of like Indic occultism. That's why I grabbed this picture, the chakra here, which is a great symbol of Indic secret lore and esoteric knowledge. So breaths are described in the different parts of breath that do correspond with a lot of old Indian notions, and they're manipulated to have long life. There's also alchemical preparations, it's called rasayana, that are used also for long life and for giving magic powers. It's a divination of your death from the way your shadow works. It establishes a 9 chakra system, which is a lot of chakras. That's a big system. So what I wanted to get to is this attempt to sort of colonize yoga, though. It wasn't perfectly done. And even the authors at the end of this text, some translation, like, we don't really know if any of this works. It might not have perfectly worked, but it showed that, that these authors in India could be Muslims, understand yogic systems, try to work them into their own system, and then the minute they got it into Arabic, it traveled. It went to Turkey, it went to Persia, it went all over the place. So these oh-so-foreign practices are placed into Persian and placed into a context that could be somewhat appreciated by the readers. And as I said, this is found throughout Islamic writing that incorporates Greek Neoplatonism along with yoga and all of the stuff in Greek astrology. So they don't take up, the Muslims don't take up the practice of yoga per se, but you do hear them doing stuff like jizya, which is saying specific prayers in a specific time in a specific way that is definitely influenced by what we call japa, which is mantra repetition in India. All right, so the whole point is Islam put down roots in India. And I'm ever going to be fighting against this idea that Islam comes in with a sword and chops people's heads off unless they colonize. That's dumb. We may have some instance of some fanatical people doing that, but that's not how it works. Islam comes to a place, unifies people, establishes culture where there is disorder, and creates a sense of harmony, a sense of social structure, a sense of cohesion. So while we Westerners seem to perpetually talk about Islam as a force of terrorism and chaos, when in fact its history has been a force of creating culture and unifying people. So I'm not much for this argument that Islam is a religion of peace, and I think it's a little wishy-washy. It is a religion of peace, salam. But what it is it's a religion that has gone to so many places and found a way to make itself at home, interact being foreign, but then becoming just almost homegrown in its own way. And I can't even imagine India without Islam. I mean, we wouldn't have the music, we wouldn't have the food, we wouldn't have the architecture. I mean, Islam has become inherently, an Indian religion, just as much as Hinduism and Buddhism. So, what I wanted you to look at today is the different manners in which India is Islamicized and the way that Islam puts down roots in India. All right, thank you very much.